Everyone thought it was just a disappearance, until a child found a human bone in the playground. The July air hung thick and wet, a suffocating blanket of heat that clung to the back of the throat. In the small forgotten town of Havenwood, summer was a season of sluggish endurance, not joy. The sun, a merciless eye in the bleached-out sky, had baked the paint on the playground equipment into a peeling mosaic of faded reds and yellows. It was here, in this crucible of afternoon heat, that 7-year-old Leo dug for treasure. His treasure wasn't gold or jewels, but the smooth, grey stones he imagined were dinosaur eggs. He'd seen them in a book at the library, fossilized and perfect, and now every rock held the promise of a prehistoric secret. His plastic shovel, a garish blue, scraped against the dry, dusty earth beneath the slide. The sound was a rhythmic she-thunk, a lonely counterpoint to the drone of a distant lawnmower. His mother, Sarah, sat on a nearby bench, her face a mask of weary distraction. The phone was pressed to her ear, her voice a low, tense murmur. "I don't know what else you want me to say, Mark. The money's gone. It's just gone." A tear traced a clean path through the film of sweat and sunscreen on her cheek. She swiped it away with an angry flick of her wrist, her focus entirely on the disembodied voice on the other end of the line, a voice that had once promised her a lifetime of security and now only delivered ultimatums. Leo, oblivious to the quiet implosion of his mother's world, felt his shovel hit something different. Not the dull thud of packed dirt or the grating scrape of stone. This was a hard, hollow clink, a different kind of sound. Curiosity, pure and bright, eclipsed his hunt for dinosaur eggs. He dropped the shovel and dug with his bare hands, his small fingers working their way into the cool, dark soil. The earth gave way, revealing a sliver of something white. Not the brilliant, clean white of a seashell, but a dull, porous, almost yellowish white. It was shaped like a half-moon, with a strange, knobbled end. He pulled it free. It was longer than his hand, curved and strangely light. It felt ancient, important. "Mummy, look," he shouted, his voice high and triumphant. "I found a real one. A real dinosaur bone." Sarah's head snapped up, her phone conversation forgotten. The raw hope in her son's voice was a physical blow, a reminder of a world of wonder she no longer inhabited. She forced a smile, a brittle thing that didn't reach her tired eyes. "That's great, sweetie. Let me see." She ended the call without a goodbye, shoving the phone into her purse as she walked toward him. The sun was relentless, and she shielded her eyes with her hand, casting a long, distorted shadow over her son. Leo stood beaming, holding his prize, aloft like a trophy dot. As she drew closer, the forced smile on her face began to falter. The object in his hand wasn't a rock. It wasn't a piece of plastic or a discarded dog toy. The shape was too specific, too organic. The curve, the texture, the way the light caught on the porous surface. It was bone, unmistakably bone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through the oppressive heat. It started in her stomach, and spread outwards, a chilling tide that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. "Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did you find that?" He pointed to the shallow hole beneath the slide. "Right there, it was buried." Her gaze followed his finger, and for the first time, she truly saw the playground. It wasn't a place of innocent joy. It was a place of neglect. The swings were rusted, the sand in the sandbox was thin and littered with cigarette butts, and the wooden frame of the climbing structure was splintered and dangerous. It was a place where things were lost, forgotten. A place where secrets could be buried. She knelt, her knees protesting as they pressed into the hard-packed dirt. "Let me see it, honey." Her voice was gentle, but her hands trembled as she took the object from him. It was heavier than she expected, and the feel of it in her palm was obscene. It was a rib. She'd seen enough crime shows, enough lurid documentaries, to know. The elegant, deadly curve of it. A human rib. Her breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the drone of the lawnmower fading into a dull roar in her ears. Every ghost story she'd ever heard, Every whispered rumor about the strange things that happened in the woods bordering the park coalesced into a single, terrifying thought. This is real, Mummy. Are you okay? Leo's voice was small, laced with a dawning fear. Her reaction was not what he had expected. The triumph had vanished from his face, replaced by a mirror of her own horror. Sarah couldn't speak. She could only stare at the bone, her mind racing. Who was it? How did it get here? Buried under a slide where children played every single day. The casual horror of it was staggering. This wasn't an ancient fossil. This was a grave. A shallow, unmarked grave in the middle of a playground. Her protective instincts, fierce and primal, surged to the surface. She grabbed Leo's hand, her grip so tight he winced. "We're leaving," she said, her voice a strangled command. Now, she practically dragged him away from the slide, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. She didn't look back. She didn't want to see the small dark hole in the earth. The place where her son's innocence had been excavated along with that terrible white crescent of bone dot. As they reached the edge of the park, a police car, old and sun-beaten, pulled into the gravel lot. It wasn't speeding, its lights weren't flashing, but its presence felt like an omen. A man in a khaki uniform stepped out, his face etched with the same weary boredom that seemed to infect the entire town. Sheriff Brody, a man who had been a fixture in Havenwood for as long as Sarah could remember. A man whose primary duties consisted of breaking up teenage parties and lecturing old Mrs. Gable about her overgrown hedges. He saw her, saw the panic in her eyes and the white-knuckled grip she had on her son's hand, and his posture straightened. "Sarah, everything all right?" She couldn't form the words. She just opened her hand. The bone lay there on her palm, a stark white accusation against her skin. Brody's eyes widened. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't just shock. It was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the bone. "Where did you get this?" "My son," she stammered, her voice cracking. He found it under the slide. The sheriff's face seemed to close down, the flicker of emotion gone as quickly as it had appeared. He became a mask of professional calm, but his eyes darted around the park, a quick, almost furtive scan of the surrounding trees and the empty street beyond. It was the glance of a man checking to see who was watching. "Okay," he said, his voice low and even, a deliberate attempt to soothe. "Okay, Sarah, I need you to give that to me. And then I need you and Leo to go straight home. Don't talk to anyone about this, not a soul, you understand." The command was so absolute, so immediate, that it cut through her panic. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, and it was wrong. This was a crime scene. Shouldn't he be calling for backup, cordoning off the area? Instead, he was telling her to be quiet. "But, shouldn't we?" She started, the words dying in her throat as he held her gaze. His eyes were hard, flinty. This wasn't the friendly small-town sheriff she knew. This was a stranger. "Go home, Sarah," he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A conspiratorial tone that chilled her to the bone. "There are things in this town that are better left buried. For everyone's sake." He carefully took the rib from her hand, his fingers barely brushing hers, and wrapped it in a handkerchief from his pocket. He didn't use an evidence bag, he used a handkerchief, like he was collecting a seashell from the beach. The injustice of it was a sudden, bitter taste in her mouth. Someone was dead. Someone was buried in a playground, their final resting place, disturbed by a 7-year-old boy with a plastic shovel. And this man, the man sworn to protect and serve, was treating it like an inconvenience. Like a piece of litter to be tidied up. A power imbalance, stark and terrifying, slammed into her. She was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet. A woman with no influence, no power. He was the law, and the law was telling her to look away. She felt Leo tremble beside her, and her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a bone anymore. It was about her son. He had found this, and she would not let that discovery be erased by a man with secrets in his eyes. "What was her name?" she asked. The question sharp and unexpected, even to her own ears. Brody froze, his hand on the door of his patrol car. What did you say? The bone, Sarah pressed, her voice gaining strength. It belonged to a woman, didn't it? I know it did. What was her name? She didn't know how she knew. It was a feeling, a deep, resonant certainty that had settled in her chest. This was a woman's bone. A forgotten woman. The sheriff stared at her, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. For a moment, she thought he was going to yell at her, threaten her. But instead, a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. You're a smart woman, Sarah, he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sort of pity. Too smart for your own good. Go home, forget what you saw, forget you ever spoke to me. If you don't, you'll be making a mistake. You'll regret for the rest of your life. And trust me, he added, his eyes flicking down to Leo, who was hiding behind her legs. It'll be a very short life. The threat hung in the thick humid air, as real and as solid as the bone he now held. In his pocket. He got into his car, the engine turning over with a tired cough, and drove away. He didn't turn on his sirens, he didn't call it in, he just drove, leaving Sarah and Leo standing alone at the edge of the playground, the silence he left behind, more deafening than any scream. Sarah stood frozen, the sheriff's words echoing in her mind. Better left buried. A mistake you'll regret. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. She looked down at the hole her son had dug, a small, dark wound. In the earth. The secret it had held was out now, and it was a secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. The simple disappearance, the one whispered about months ago, the one everyone had dismissed, was no longer simple. It had a name. She didn't know it yet, but she would. She would find it. For the woman who had been silenced, and for the little boy whose innocence had been buried in that playground, she would find it. The sun beat down on her, but she felt nothing but ice in her veins. The fight had just begun. She clutched Leo's hand and walked away. Not towards home, but towards the one place she knew she could find answers. A place the sheriff would never expect her to go. The local library. To the archives. To the old newspapers that chronicled every birth, every death, every disappearance in Havenwood's long-shadowed history. The sheriff had made a critical error. He hadn't just threatened a woman, he had threatened a mother, and he had just created an enemy who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The library was an oasis of cool, musty silence after the oppressive heat of the afternoon. The librarian, a woman named Eleanor who had presided over the stacks since before Sarah was born, gave her a questioning look. Sarah was not a regular. Her life was too chaotic for the quiet contemplation of books. I need to see the newspaper. Archives, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. From the last year or so, Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on Leo, who clung to his mother's side. Of course, the microfiche reader is in the back. Sarah spent the next hour scrolling through grainy black and white images of local news. Car accidents, town council meetings, high school football victories. The mundane, predictable rhythm of small-town life. And then she found it. A small article, tucked away on page 3, dated 6 months prior, local woman reported missing. Headline was unremarkable. The story, even more so. Jessica Miller, 24, was reported missing by her landlord after failing to pay her rent for 2 consecutive months. Friends say Miller was unreliable and had a history of leaving town without notice. Police do not suspect foul play. There was a photo, a grainy, overexposed snapshot of a young woman with a wide, hopeful smile and dark, intelligent eyes. The same eyes that Sarah had seen in her mind's eye when she held the bone. Jessica Miller. Her name was Jessica Miller. Sarah stared at the photo, her heart aching. This was her. The woman in the playground, dismissed, forgotten, labeled unreliable, so no one would look too hard. Police do not suspect foul play. The words were a lie, a carefully constructed piece of fiction designed to quell curiosity. And the man who had fed that lie to the press was the same man who had just threatened her life, Sheriff Brody. A cold, hard certainty settled in her gut. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a conspiracy. And it went deeper than just the sheriff, who was Jessica Miller, and who in this town had wanted her gone so badly that they would bury her in a child's playground and then erase her from history. Printed the article. The machine worried loudly in the silent library. The piece of paper felt warm in her hand, a fragile piece of evidence, a single thread in a web of deceit. As she folded it and tucked it into her pocket, she felt a new kind of fear, colder and more profound than the terror she had felt in the park. This was no longer just about finding justice for a stranger. It was about survival. She had stumbled into something dark and dangerous. Something that had been festering beneath the placid surface of Havenwood for a long, long time. And now, it knew her name. She looked at her son, his small face pale and worried, and she knew she had to uncover the truth. Not just for Jessica, but for Leo. She had to expose the rot in this town before it consumed them both. The cliffhanger wasn't just what would happen next, it was whether she could survive long enough to find out. She had the first piece of the puzzle. Now she had to find the others, before the people who had buried Jessica Miller decided to bury her too. The walk home was a blur of heightened senses. Every rustle of leaves in the overgrown yards sounded like footsteps. Every passing car seemed to slow down, its occupants staring. The familiar streets of her neighborhood had become a hostile landscape, every shadow a potential threat. The sheriff's words played on a loop in her mind. A mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. The threat wasn't just for her, it was for Leo. He had seen her take the bone, seen her confront Brody. He was a witness, a set witness. The thought made her stomach clench with a fear so visceral, it almost brought her to her knees. When they reached their small rented house, she locked the door behind them, sliding the deadbolt and fastening the chain. It was a flimsy defense against the kind of danger she now faced, but it was all she had. She made Leo a sandwich he didn't eat and put on a cartoon he didn't watch. He sat on the floor, his eyes wide and vacant, a miniature statue of trauma. She sat at the kitchen table. The printed article about Jessica Miller spread out before her, unreliable. History of leaving town. It was character assassination, pure and simple. A way to make the victim responsible for her own disappearance. Who were her friends? Who was her landlord? These were the next threads she had to pull. Her phone buzzed on the table, the sound so loud in the quiet house that she jumped. It was an unknown number. Her blood ran cold. She stared at it, her heart pounding. It could be anyone, a concerned neighbor, a wrong number, or it could be him, Brody, or someone worse. She let it ring, each shrill summons grating on her already frayed nerves. It rang 10 times before finally falling silent. A minute later, it buzzed again. The same number. They were persistent. They wanted to know if she was home. They wanted to know if she was alone. She silenced the phone, her hand shaking. She was in over her head, a single mother with a mountain of debt, a broken-down car, and a 7-year-old son who had just unearthed a murder. She had no weapons, no allies, no resources. All she had was a name, a grainy photograph, and a firestorm of righteous fury. It would have to be enough. She looked at the photo of Jessica Miller, at her hopeful, trusting smile, and made a silent promise. I will not let them forget you. The immediate shock had passed, leaving in its wake a cold, terrifying clarity. This was a fight for 2 lives now, the one that had been stolen, and the one she was desperately trying to protect. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the soul, that the night was far from over. The real horror was just beginning. The victim was a ghost, long before she was a body. Jessica Miller had drifted into Havenwood like a leaf on the autumn wind, renting a small second-floor apartment above the sleepy hardware store on Main Street. She was a painter, or so she told her landlord, a man named Henderson, whose interest in his tenants began and ended with whether the rent check cleared on the first of the month. She was quiet, kept to herself, and paid in cash. For 3 months, She was the perfect tenant. Then, the money stopped. Henderson was not a patient man. He was a creature of habit and ledgers, and Jessica's sudden delinquency was a disruption to his orderly world. He'd taped a notice to her door, then another. He'd called the number she'd given him, a prepaid cell that went straight to a full voicemail box. Finally, with a huff of self-righteous indignation, he'd used his master key and let himself in. The apartment was almost empty. A mattress on the floor, a single suitcase in the corner, a few cans of soup in the cupboard. But the walls were covered in not her paintings, but her sketches. Dozens of them tacked up with pushpins, a chaotic gallery of faces. The people of Havenwood, captured in charcoal with a startling, almost brutal honesty. She had a gift for seeing past the surface, for capturing the flicker of greed in a banker's eye, the deep-seated wariness in a waitress's smile, the carefully concealed cruelty in a politician's smirk. And one face appeared more than any other. A man whose portrait was rendered with a mixture of fascination and fear. A man with a square jaw, a charming, predatory smile, and eyes that held a chilling emptiness. It was a face everyone in knew. It was the face of Richard Blackwood, the town's unofficial king, the man who owned the lumber mill, the largest employer for 50 miles. The man whose family had founded the town, whose name was on the library, the park, the very ground they stood on. Henderson had stared at the drawings, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. This was more than just art. It was an investigation. He saw his own face on the wall, his pursed lips and shifty eyes captured with unnerving accuracy. He felt exposed, violated. He took down the portraits of Blackwood first, his hands trembling slightly, then he took down his own. He packed the rest of the sketches into a cardboard box, shoved it into the back of a closet, and called the sheriff. He told Brody the girl had skipped town, left the place a mess. He didn't mention the drawings. He knew, with the instinct of a man who understood the unspoken rules of power in a small town, that some things were better left unsaid. Richard Blackwood was not a man to be crossed. The antagonist, Richard Blackwood, moved through Havenwood with the easy, predatory grace of a man who owned the world he walked on. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a fortune that insulated him from the mundane struggles of the people he employed. His generosity was legendary: new uniforms for the high school football team, a new wing for the tiny local hospital, a lavish annual picnic for the entire town. But his generosity was a tool, a means of ensuring loyalty and silence. It was an investment. Blackwood's past was a carefully curated narrative of success and philanthropy. But beneath the polished veneer lay a foundation of rot. His family's wealth hadn't been built on hard work. It had been built on exploitation, on land grabs and union busting and deals made in smoke-filled back rooms. Richard had inherited not just his family's money, but their ruthlessness. He had a darkness in him, a void that could only be filled by power and control. He collected things, businesses, properties, people. He had met Jessica Miller by chance. Her car had broken down on the side of the road, and he, in his gleaming silver Mercedes, had stopped to help. He was charmed by her beauty, by her naivete, by the fact that she had no idea who he was. She was new, untainted by the town's ingrained deference to his name. To her, he was just a handsome stranger. He became her patron, her secret lover. He bought her paints, paid her rent in cash, visited her in the dead of night. He saw her as another acquisition, a beautiful, exotic bird he could keep in a cage. But he had underestimated her. He thought she was just a pretty face, a talented but simple girl. He didn't realize she was a mirror. He would talk to her in the post-coital darkness of her small apartment, boasting of his conquests, his deals, his manipulations. He confessed his sins to her not out of a need for absolution, but out of arrogance. He needed an audience, and she was the perfect one. Silent, beautiful, and, he thought, powerless. He told her about the shortcuts at the mill that endangered his workers. He told her about the bribes to the state inspector. He told her about the real reason the river downstream from the mill was dying. He told her everything, never suspecting that her quiet attention was not adoration, but observation. He never suspected that every word he spoke was being recorded, not just in her memory, but on a small digital voice recorder she kept hidden beneath her mattress. Jessica wasn't naive. She was a survivor. She had grown up in the foster system, bounced from one broken home to another. She had learned to be invisible, to watch, to listen. She had come to Havenwood to escape a past she never spoke of, hoping to lose herself in a place where no one knew her name. But in Richard Blackwood, she had found a monster far more dangerous than any she had left behind. At first, she was enthralled by him, by the power he radiated. But as his confessions grew darker, as she saw the casual cruelty he inflicted on those he deemed beneath him, her fascination turned to revulsion. The recordings were her insurance policy, her escape plan. She would wait until she had enough, and then she would disappear, using the threat of exposure to keep him from following. The hidden witness was a boy named Thomas, a teenager who worked part-time at the hardware store under Jessica's apartment. Thomas was a ghost of a different sort. He was painfully shy, with a severe stutter that made him a target for the cruel, casual bullying of his peers. He found solace in the quiet, orderly world of the hardware store, in the smell of sawdust and machine oil. He saw Jessica Miller almost every day. He'd help her carry her groceries up the stairs, or she'd stop to say hello. Her smile, one of the few genuine kindnesses he'd ever known. He had a secret, hopeless crush on her. He would listen to the muffled sounds from her apartment at night, the low murmur of voices, the soft strains of music, the creak of the floorboards. He was there the night she disappeared. He was in the store's back room, oiling a chainsaw, the smell of gasoline sharp in the air. He heard the argument. It wasn't the first time. He'd heard them before. Blackwood's voice a low, menacing rumble, Jessica's a sharp, defiant counterpoint, but this time was different. There was a new note in her voice. Fear. Real fear. "You can't keep me here, Richard," she had shouted, her voice clear through the thin floorboards. "I'm leaving, and if you try to stop me, I'll ruin you. I have proof. I have everything." There was a moment of silence, a heavy, suffocating pause, and then Blackwood's voice, no longer charming, no longer seductive. It was flat, cold, and dead. "You have nothing." Thomas heard a thud, a heavy, sickening sound, like a sack of grain being dropped on the floor. Then, a choked gasp. Then, silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than any scream. He stayed frozen in the back room, his heart hammering in his chest, his stutter so bad he couldn't have called for help, even if he'd had the courage. He heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving around the apartment above. He heard the squeak of the stairs. He peered through the grimy window of the back door and saw it. Richard Blackwood, his face pale and set in the moonlight, carrying a large rolled-up rug over his shoulder. The rug was heavy, and it sagged. In the middle, it's shaped disturbingly human. Blackwood loaded the rug into the trunk of his Mercedes and drove away, disappearing into the night. Thomas didn't move for an hour. He just stood there, shaking, the sound of that terrible thud replaying. In his mind, he knew what he had seen. He had witnessed a murder. The next day, Sheriff Brody came to the store. He spoke to Henderson. He didn't speak to Thomas. No one ever spoke to Thomas. He was invisible. He heard Henderson tell the sheriff the girl had skipped out. He heard the sheriff agree, his voice full of a false, weary resignation. It was a lie. A neat, tidy lie that everyone seemed willing to accept. Thomas knew the truth, but he also knew the power of Richard Blackwood. He knew what happened to people who crossed him. He had seen it his whole life. The man who had tried to unionize the mill workers and ended up in a wheelchair after a hunting accident. The journalist from the city who had started asking questions about the mill's environmental record and was run out of town after a trumped-up drug charge. Fear was a cage, and Thomas had lived in it his entire life. His stutter, his shyness, his invisibility, they were the bars of that cage. He said nothing. He buried the memory of that night deep inside him, hoping it would stay buried forever. He went back to his life of stocking shelves and being ignored. The silent, hidden witness to a crime everyone in town had agreed to pretend never happened. The secret festered inside him, a toxic poison, waiting for the day when someone, anyone, would be brave enough to ask the right question. He was the keeper of the truth, a truth he was too terrified to speak. He was the ghost in the machine, the boy who saw everything and said nothing. His silence, a form of complicity that was slowly eating him alive. Sarah, meanwhile, was beginning her own quiet investigation. Armed with Jessica's name, she started where the official investigation had ended. She found the address of the apartment above the hardware store. The windows were dark and empty. A faded, peeling for rent sign was taped to the inside of the glass. She went inside the store, the bell above the door announcing her presence. With a cheerful jingle that felt jarringly out of place. The man behind the counter was Henderson. He looked at her with an air of impatient suspicion. "Can I help you?" I'm looking for information," Sarah began, her voice hesitant. "About a former tenant, Jessica Miller." Henderson's face hardened. "The girl who skipped out on her rent. What about her?" "I think something might have happened to her," Sarah said, her gaze steady. Henderson scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Nothing happened to her. She was a flake, an artist. You know the type. Here one day, gone the next. Left the place a mess. Cost me a month's rent." "Did you go into her apartment after she left?" Sarah pressed. "Of course I did. It's my property. What did you find?" Henderson's eyes shifted, a quick, nervous glance towards the back room. "Nothing. Clothes, some food. Junk. I cleaned it all out. It was a lie." Sarah could feel it. The way he avoided her gaze, the defensive tone in his voice. He was hiding. Something the police reports said her friends claimed she was unreliable. Who were her friends? "How should I know?" he snapped. "I'm her landlord, not her social secretary. Now, if you're not here to buy anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'm a busy man." As Sarah turned to go, she saw him, a boy, no older than her nephew, standing in the aisle, pretending to inspect a box of nails. He was tall and painfully thin, with a shock of sandy hair that fell over his eyes. But it was his expression that caught her attention. It was a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He had been listening to every word. She walked out of the store, her mind racing. Henderson was lying, and that boy was terrified. He knew something. She waited across the street, pretending to look in the window of the bakery, her heart pounding. 10 minutes later, the boy emerged from the hardware store, his shift apparently over. He walked quickly, his head down, his shoulders hunched. Sarah followed him at a distance. He led her away from the main street, down a series of quiet, residential roads, to a small, run-down house at the edge of town. He fumbled with his keys and disappeared inside. She knew she couldn't approach him directly. He was too scared. But she had found another thread. The boy from the hardware store. The silent witness. She didn't know his name yet, but she would. She would find a way to make him talk. The victim, the antagonist, the witness. The 3 points of the triangle were beginning to emerge from the fog, each one trailing a history of secrets, wounds, and lies. And Sarah was standing in the middle, pulling the strings, not knowing if they would lead her to the truth or tighten around her own neck. The days that followed, Leo's discovery bled into a paranoid haze for Sarah. The world had shrunk to the size of her small house, the windows of which she now kept perpetually committed. Every creak of the floorboards, every car that drove too slowly down her street, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. Sleep offered no respite, populated by shadowy figures and the recurring image of a single white bone lying in her palm. The threat from Sheriff Brody had become a living entity in her home, a constant, unseen presence that made the air thick with fear. Her attempts to dig deeper into Jessica Miller's life were met with a wall of silence, as solid and impenetrable as a tombstone. She called the number from the old newspaper article a disconnected line. She searched for her online, But Jessica Miller was a common name, and the woman from Havenwood had left behind a ghost of a digital footprint, no social media, no public records beyond her tenancy. It was as if she had been deliberately erased. The pressure from her own life didn't stop. Her ex-husband, Mark, called relentlessly, his voice a venomous cocktail of anger and self-pity. The car payment is late, Sarah. The credit card is maxed out. What the hell is going on? Are you gambling again? His accusations were a cruel twist of the knife, referencing a brief, desperate period after their divorce, when she had sought solace in the flashing lights of online poker. It was a wound he knew exactly how to reopen. I don't have it, Mark, she'd say, her voice flat and lifeless. There is no money. Her car, a sputtering decade-old sedan, finally died, the engine giving out with a final, pathetic clunk. In the driveway, it was another bar on the cage that was closing in around her. She was stranded, isolated, her world shrinking with every passing hour. The humiliation came from the town itself. When she walked to the grocery store, pulling Leo along in his little red wagon, she felt the stares. Whispers seemed to follow her down the aisles. She saw Mrs. Gable, the town's chief gossip, talking animatedly with a friend, both of them casting furtive glances in her direction. Had Brody said something? Had he started a rumor? Was he painting her as unstable, a crazy woman, a liar? It was a classic small-town tactic, a way of discrediting a threat before it could even take root. She was being publicly shamed, ostracized by the very community she lived in. The antagonist, meanwhile, was growing bolder. Richard Blackwood, who had always been a distant, almost mythical figure in the town, suddenly seemed to be everywhere. His silver Mercedes would glide past her house, a silent, predatory shark in the suburban waters. She saw him at the grocery store, holding court near the produce section, his laughter loud and confident. He looked directly at her, his eyes cold and empty, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement. I see you. I know what you're doing, and I'm not afraid. The message was clear. He was untouchable. He was reminding her of her place in the food chain, of the vast unbridgeable chasm between his power and her powerlessness. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was flaunting his freedom, his dominance, while she was a prisoner in her own home. The true escalation, the moment that pushed Sarah from fear into a cold, hard rage, came a week after the discovery. It was late afternoon. Leo was in the backyard, listlessly pushing a toy truck through the patchy grass. Sarah was at the kitchen window, watching him, when a dark sedan pulled up in front of the house. It wasn't Brody's patrol car. This one was newer, more expensive, with tinted windows that reflected the sky like black mirrors. Two men got out. They were large and impassive, dressed in cheap suits that did little to conceal their bulky frames. They didn't look like they belonged in Havenwood. They looked like they had been sent from somewhere else, somewhere colder and harder. They walked up her driveway with a confident, unhurried stride and knocked on the door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, authoritative thump, thump, thump. Sarah's blood ran cold. She motioned for Leo to come inside, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the latch on the back door. She scooped him up, his small body trembling against hers, and carried him to his room. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice tight with terror. "Don't make a sound." The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. She walked to the front door, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She looked through the peephole. The two men stood on her porch, their faces blank, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "We have a message for you, Ms. Jenkins," one of the men said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "From a friend. He's concerned about you. He thinks you've been under a lot of stress lately." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her back pressed against the door. "He thinks you've been spreading stories." The man continued, his voice dropping slightly. "Nasty, untrue stories. And he's worried that if you keep it up, something bad might happen." "An accident? You have a son, don't you, Ms. Jenkins?" It would be a tragedy if he had to grow up without a mother. The threat, so bold and direct, stole the air from her lungs. This was Blackwood's doing. This was his response to her quiet inquiries. He hadn't sent the sheriff this time. He had sent his thugs, his enforcers. "You should be careful," the man said, his voice a low growl. "This town has a way of taking care of its problems. You and your boy should pack up and leave. Go somewhere else, start over. It would be the best thing for everyone." Then, one of the men reached into his jacket and pulled something out. He placed it on her doormat. It was a small, plastic shovel. A garish blue. Leo's shovel. The one he had left behind at the playground. The sight of it broke something inside her. It was a symbol, a message. "We were there, we know what your son found, and we can get to him whenever we want." She watched through the peephole as the two men walked back to their car and drove away. She waited until the car was out of sight before she slowly, mechanically, unlocked the door. She stared down at the shovel. It was a declaration of war. The witness, Thomas, was fighting his own silent battle. The encounter with Sarah in the hardware store had shaken him to his core. For the first time since that night, someone else knew, or suspected, her questions, her intensity. The desperate look in her eyes, it had cracked the shell of his fear. He started seeing things, or maybe he was just starting to notice them. Sheriff Brody's patrol car, parked across the street from his house late at night, the engine off, just watching. A phone call to his house where the line went dead the moment he answered. His boss, Henderson, watching him with a new, suspicious glint in his eye. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach. But something else was growing alongside it. Guilt. He saw Jessica's face every time he closed his eyes. He heard her scream, that final choked-off gasp. His silence was a betrayal. He was letting her killer walk free, letting him smile and wave and own the town while she lay in the cold, dark earth. His conscience and his fear were at war, a brutal, exhausting conflict that played out in the silence of his own mind. He wanted to talk. He wanted to tell someone what he saw. But the image of Blackwood's face in the moonlight, cold and merciless, held him captive. The stutter that had plagued him his whole life grew worse. The words trapped in his throat, suffocated by a terror he couldn't name. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, torn between the instinct to survive and the desperate, dawning need to do the right thing. The escalating conflict wasn't just happening to Sarah. It was happening inside the very people whose silence protected the guilty. The pressure was building, a slow, inexorable tightening of a screw, pushing them all closer to a breaking point that would be both devastating and inevitable. The breaking point for Thomas came in the form of a betrayal. He arrived at work one evening to find Henderson and Sheriff Brody waiting for him in the back room. The air was thick with a cloying artificial pine scent from a cheap air freshener, a futile attempt to mask the smell of fear. "Thomas," Brody said, his voice deceptively gentle, "we need to have a little chat." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He tried to speak, to ask what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. A strangled guttural sound was all he could manage. "Take it easy, son," Brody said, putting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "No one's in any trouble. We just have some questions." About the woman who used to live upstairs, Jessica Miller. Thomas's eyes darted to Henderson, who stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had been sold out. Henderson must have told Brody about his strange behavior, about the way he'd been acting ever since Sarah had come into the store. What about her? Thomas stammered, the words fighting their way out. "We have reason to believe she was involved in some unsavory activities," Brody said, his eyes narrowing. "Drugs, prostitution, we think. She might have had some dangerous associates. Did you ever see anyone suspicious visiting her?" It was a trap. They were trying to build a new narrative, a new lie, to cover the old one. They were going to posthumously frame Jessica, turn her into a criminal, to justify her death. The injustice of it was a physical blow. "Unanode," Thomas whispered. "She was nice." Brody's smile was thin and cold. "Son, We know you're hiding something. Henderson here says, you've been acting mighty strange lately, scared. Like you've seen a ghost. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Did you see something you shouldn't have, Thomas? Did you see who she was with that night? The night she left? Thomas was shaking, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked at Brody's face, at the cold, hard eyes of the law, and he saw the same emptiness he had seen in Richard Blackwood's. They were the same. Two sides of the same corrupt coin. I don't. Think carefully, son, Brody interrupted, his grip on Thomas's shoulder tightening to a painful vice. Your boss's generosity only goes so far. A boy like you, a boy with your difficulties, you need this job. It would be a shame if you lost it. It would be a shame if people started thinking you were mixed up in all this. A boy who can't even speak for himself. It would be easy to pin something on you. The threat was unmistakable. Stay silent, or we will destroy you. We will make you the accomplice. We will feed you to the wolves. The war inside Thomas reached its bloody climax. The fear of Blackwood, of Brody, of losing his job, of being framed it, was a roaring inferno. But the image of Jessica's face, her kind smile, the memory of her voice, it was a single defiant spark in the darkness. His silence wasn't just protecting him. It was condemning her all over again. He looked Brody square in the eye. The stutter, the lifelong companion of his fear, suddenly vanished. The words came out clear, cold and steady. I saw him, he said. Brody's smile faltered. Saw who? Richard Blackwood, Thomas said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength in the small silent room. I saw him carry her out. She was dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Henderson's face went pale. Brody's eyes widened, first in shock, then in a flash of pure, murderous rage. The conflict had escalated beyond threats and intimidation. The truth was out, spoken aloud in a dusty back room, and now there was no going back. The stakes had just become life and death. The moment the words left Thomas's lips, the atmosphere in the back room crackled with a new, lethal energy. The pretense of a friendly chat evaporated, replaced by the raw, undisguised menace of cornered animals. Sheriff Brody's face, which had been a mask of condescending authority, contorted into a snarl of pure fury. He took a step back, his hand instinctively dropping to the butt of his holstered pistol. You little bastard, he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. You have no idea what you just did. Henderson, who had been a silent, smug spectator, now looked terrified. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with panic. I told you he was a problem, Sheriff, he stammered, wringing his hands. I told you he was unstable. But Brody wasn't listening. His entire focus was on Thomas, who stood his ground. His newfound resolve, a fragile shield against the storm he had just unleashed. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was now overlaid with a strange sense of liberation. The secret was out. The burden was no longer his alone. You can't hurt me, Thomas said, the stutter returning slightly under the weight of Brody's glare. I wrote it all down. Everything I saw, I gave it to a lawyer. If anything happens to me, he sends it to the state police. To the newspapers, it was a bluff, a desperate last-ditch gamble, born of pure survival instinct. He had no lawyer, no letter. All he had was the truth and the hope that the threat of exposure would be enough to keep him alive. For a heart-stopping moment, Brody's eyes flickered with uncertainty. The bluff had landed. The sheriff, a man accustomed to absolute control, was suddenly faced with a variable he hadn't anticipated, a loose end that could unravel everything. But the moment passed. Brody's face hardened again, a cold, calculated mask sliding back into place. You're a liar, he said, his voice flat. There's no letter. There's no lawyer. There's just you, a scared, stuttering kid nobody will ever believe. He turned to Henderson. Get out, and keep your mouth shut. You were never here. Henderson didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled out of the room, leaving Thomas alone with the sheriff. Brody walked over to the door and locked it. The sound of the bolt sliding home was a death knell. "We could have done this the easy way, kid," Brody said, slowly unholstering his gun. He didn't point it at Thomas, he just held it, the black metal gleaming under the single bare light bulb. "You could have kept your mouth shut. You could have lived your quiet little life. But you had to be a hero. This was it. This was the end." Thomas closed his eyes, the image of Jessica Miller's smiling face flashing in his mind. He had tried. He had finally spoken the truth. Maybe that was all that mattered. But as the silence stretched on, a new sound emerged. A faint, electronic beeping beep beep beep. Brody froze. "What the hell is that?" Thomas opened his eyes. The sound was coming from his own pocket. His hand trembled as he reached in and pulled out his phone. The screen was lit up. It was recording. He had, on a sudden wild impulse, activated the voice memo app just before Brody had entered the room. He had no idea if it would work, if it would even capture anything. But he had done it. He held up the phone, the red recording icon pulsing like a tiny, defiant heart. "You were saying," he whispered, "the entire conversation, the threats, the intimidation." Brody's admission that he was covering for Blackwood. His threat to frame Thomas. It was all there. A digital ghost. An electronic witness that could not be bullied or silenced. The plot twist hung in the air, a stunning reversal of power. The gun in Brody's hand was suddenly useless. The real weapon was the small glowing rectangle in Thomas's hand. Brody's face was a canvas of disbelief, rage, and dawning, sickening realization. He had been so arrogant, so confident in his power, that he had never even considered the possibility of being recorded. He had walked right into a trap of his own making. "Give me the phone," he snarled, taking a step forward. Thomas said, his courage surging. He held the phone tighter, his thumb hovering over the send button. He had Sarah's number. He'd gotten it from the caller ID when she'd called the store. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. "I will shoot you," Brody said, his voice shaking with a rage that was bordering on hysteria. He raised the gun, aiming it directly at Thomas's chest. "I will put a bullet in your heart and throw your body in the river. No one will ever find you. And everyone will hear this," Thomas countered, his voice clear and steady. "They will hear you threaten me. They will hear you confess. You'll be ruined. Blackwood will be ruined. It will all come out." It was a standoff. A 21st century duel fought not with pistols at dawn, but with a firearm and a smartphone in a dusty, forgotten back room. The stakes had shifted from personal survival to public scandal. The conspiracy, which had been held together by fear and silence, was now teetering on the brink of collapse. All because of a hidden clue, a digital recording that had captured the rot at the heart of Havenwood. Sarah, at that very moment, was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the blue plastic shovel. It was a symbol of her failure, of her inability to protect her son. The men in the sedan had shattered her last vestiges of hope. She was beaten. They had won. She had started to pack a bag, a few clothes for her and Leo, a handful of cash she had stashed away. The men's advice echoed in her head: pack up and leave. It would be the best thing for everyone. Maybe they were right. Maybe. The only way to keep Leo safe was to run. Her phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden table. It was an unknown number. Another threat. Another warning. She almost ignored it. But something made her pick it up. She didn't say hello, she just listened, and she heard it. Brody's voice, raw and furious. "I will put a bullet in your heart and throw your body in the river." Then another voice, younger, terrified, but defiant. "And everyone will hear this." Her heart stopped. She recognized the second voice. It was the boy from the hardware store. Thomas. He had done it. He had gotten proof. A new message alert popped up on her screen. A single audio file, sent from the unknown number. She tapped on it, her hands trembling. The recording began to play from the beginning. "Thomas, we need to have a little chat." She listened, her blood turning to ice, as the entire conversation unfolded. The threats, the coercion, the blatant conspiracy to cover up a murder. It was all there, undeniable, irrefutable. The hidden clue she had been so desperately searching for had just fallen into her lap. The despair that had been crushing her moments before was burned away by a white-hot surge of adrenaline. This changed everything. This wasn't just her word against theirs anymore. This was their own words, their own guilt, captured and preserved. The stakes had been raised to their absolute maximum. This was no longer about a quiet investigation. This was about a public explosion. She had the evidence to bring down the sheriff, to expose Richard Blackwood, to tear the corrupt heart out of Havenwood, but they had. Thomas, she had to act. Now, before Brody realized he had nothing left to lose. Before he pulled the trigger, she looked at the shovel on her table. It was no longer a symbol of fear, it was a call to arms. She grabbed her keys, her mind racing. The police were not an option. The law was the enemy. She had to get that recording out. She had to create a firestorm so big that they couldn't possibly contain it. She knew exactly who to call. Her cousin, a journalist for a major city newspaper, a woman who lived for scandals like this. But first, she had to save Thomas. She ran out of her house, leaving the half-packed bag on the floor. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't have a plan. All she had was a recording, a desperate mother's courage, and the knowledge that a boy's life was hanging in the balance. The tension had been cranked to its breaking point. The fuse had been lit, and the whole damn town was about to explode. She got in her car, praying it would start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then, miraculously, roared to life. She peeled out of her driveway, her tires squealing on the asphalt. She raced towards Main Street, her phone clutched in her hand. She hit forward on the audio file and sent it to her cousin with a single frantic message. Listen to this. His name is Richard Blackwood. The sheriff is in on it. They have the witness. Hardware store on Main. Send help. Back in the storeroom, the standoff continued. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Brody's face was slick with perspiration, his eyes darting between Thomas and the phone in his hand. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he was becoming more unstable by the second. Last chance, kid, he rasped. Delete it now. It's too late, Thomas said, his voice shaking but firm. I already sent it. It was another bluff. He hadn't had time. But the lie landed with the force of a physical blow. Brody's face crumpled in despair. He knew it was over. The recording was out. The secret was out. The sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, pierced the tense silence. Not the familiar, tired siren of Havenwood's single patrol car. This was different. Multiple sirens, wailing in unison, converging on their location. Sarah had done it. Her message had gotten through. Help was coming. Brody heard the sirens, and a desperate, wild look entered his eyes. He was trapped. There was no escape. He looked at Thomas, the boy who had brought his world crashing down, and his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. I'm going down, he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. You're coming with me. He lunged forward, the gun firing with a deafening roar in the enclosed space. The sound was a physical explosion, a concussive blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, a strangled cry escaping his lips, and braced for the impact, for the searing pain that would end his life. The plot had twisted, the tension had peaked, and now, it all came down to this single, violent, irreversible moment. The gunshot echoed through the narrow confines of the storeroom, a deafening, final sound. But the searing pain Thomas expected never came. He opened his eyes, his body trembling, his ears ringing. Sheriff Brody was on the floor, clutching his own shoulder, a dark blossoming stain spreading across his khaki uniform. His gun lay several feet away, skittering to a stop against the stack of paint cans. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh light of the main store, was Henderson. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. In his hand, He held a heavy Castian skillet from the store's housewares section. I couldn't just leave," Henderson stammered, the skillet shaking in his hand. "He was going to kill you." The man who had been a willing accomplice, a silent partner in the town's conspiracy of fear, had finally chosen a side. The instinct for self-preservation had been momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of human decency. It was a small, pathetic act of redemption, but it had been enough. The sirens were deafening now, pulling up outside. The front door of the hardware store burst open, and 2 state troopers, clad in dark blue uniforms and body armor, stormed in, their weapons drawn. They were followed by a whirlwind of chaos paramedics, more officers, and a woman with a press pass hanging around her neck and a phone held up, live streaming the entire scene. Sarah's cousin, the cinematic payoff was swift and brutal. The troopers secured the room, their movements efficient and professional. One of them kicked Brody's gun away while the other cuffed him, reading him his rights in a flat, dispassionate monotone that was a stark contrast to the sheriff's hysterical, pain-filled curses. The facade of the powerful small-town lawman had been stripped away, revealing the pathetic, cornered criminal beneath. Paramedics rushed to Thomas, checking him for injuries, their voices a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. He was unhurt, but shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline and terror finally catching up with him. He sank to the floor, clutching the phone that had become his salvation. The audio file still open on the screen. Sarah's cousin, a woman named Maria, pushed past the officers, her phone's camera capturing every detail. "That's him," she said, her voice a clear, authoritative narration for her online audience. "That's Sheriff Brody, being arrested in connection with the disappearance and suspected murder of Jessica Miller. We have an audio recording, sent to this station just moments ago, of the sheriff threatening a key witness and admitting to a cover-up involving prominent local businessman Richard Blackwood." The name, spoken aloud in the midst of the chaos, hung in the air like a death sentence. The public exposure was immediate and absolute. The story was no longer a secret, it was breaking news, spreading like wildfire across social media. The livestream gaining thousands of viewers by the second. The second act of the public justice play took place across town. A convoy of state police cars, their lights flashing, descended upon the Blackwood estate, a sprawling mansion set on a hill overlooking the town he had once owned. They found Richard Blackwood in his study, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. Watching the livestream of Brody's arrest on his laptop, his face was a mask of cold, arrogant disbelief. He truly believed he was untouchable. The arrest was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. There was no struggle, no chase. Just the quiet click of handcuffs and the reading of his rights. But the cameras were there, capturing the moment for the world to see. The King of Havenwood, his face pale, his expensive suit looking cheap and ill-fitting in the harsh glare of the flashing lights, being led away like a common criminal. The power he had wielded for so long had evaporated in an instant. Exposed as a hollow sham, the public's rage was a palpable force. The comments on the livestream were a torrent of fury and disgust. The people of Havenwood, who had lived in fear and deference for so long, were suddenly empowered by the anonymity of the internet, their long-suppressed resentment erupting in a digital firestorm. The conspiracy of silence had been shattered, replaced by a roar of collective outrage. The most cathartic moment, the true emotional climax of the public shaming, came later that evening. Sarah, who had been taken to the state police barracks to give her statement, was finally reunited with Leo. She held him close, burying her face in his hair, the smell of his shampoo a grounding, life-affirming scent. As she was leaving, she saw him, Thomas. He was sitting on a bench, a blanket draped over his shoulders, talking to a detective. He looked small and fragile, but for the first time since she had seen him in the hardware store, the terror was gone from his eyes. It had been replaced by a quiet, exhausted strength. Their eyes met across the busy room. No words were exchanged. None were needed. A silent, profound understanding passed between them. They were two ordinary people who had been pushed to the brink, who had found an extraordinary courage they never knew they possessed. They had faced down the monster and won. The final poetic twist of fate was delivered by Henderson. In his statement to the police, riddled with fear and a desperate desire to save his own skin, he told them everything. He told them about the argument he'd overheard. He told them about seeing Blackwood carry the rug out to his car. And then, he told them about the box. Her drawings, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She drew everyone. She saw everything. I hid them in a box. In the back of the closet, in her old apartment, the police retrieved the box. The charcoal sketches, which Henderson had tried to hide, became the prosecution's most powerful exhibit. They were a visual diary of Blackwood's sociopathy, a gallery of his victims and enablers, and in the center of it all, the portraits of Blackwood himself, his charm rendered as a predatory mask, his eyes a window into a soulless void. Jessica Miller, the artist, the ghost, had delivered her own testimony from beyond the grave. Her art, the one thing she had brought with her to Havenwood, became the instrument of her final explosive justice. The town's secrets had been exhumed, and the public spectacle of the downfall of its king was a brutal, cathartic, and unforgettable cinematic payoff. The autumn that followed was a season of quiet reckoning. The media circus eventually packed up and left, moving on to the next scandal, the next outrage. But in Havenwood, the echoes of the explosion lingered, a permanent scar on the town's psyche. The trial of Richard Blackwood and Sheriff Brody was a swift and brutal affair. The audio recording, the charcoal sketches, and the testimony of a newly confident, stutter-free Thomas painted a picture so damning that a conviction was all but inevitable. They were both sentenced to life in prison, their names now synonymous. With the rot they had presided over for so long, the emotional aftermath for Sarah was a complex tapestry of relief and sorrow. The constant grinding fear that had been her companion for weeks had finally receded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. The threats were gone. The monsters were caged, and for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. She sold her story to a national magazine, the money enough to pay off her debts, buy a reliable car, and put a down payment on a small house in a new town. Far away from the ghosts of Havenwood, one crisp October afternoon, before they left for good, she took Leo back to the playground. It was different now. The town council, shamed into action by the negative publicity, had replaced the old, rusted equipment. There was a new slide, a bright, cheerful yellow, and the ground beneath it was covered in a thick, soft layer of wood chips. Leo, who had been quiet and withdrawn for weeks, ran towards the new swings. His laughter, tentative at first, then growing in strength, a sound that was more beautiful to Sarah than any symphony. She watched him, a bittersweet ache in her chest. He was a child again, but she knew the memory of what he had found would always be there, a shadow in the back of his mind. The cost of the truth had been a piece of his innocence. She walked over to a quiet corner of the park, near a grove of old oak trees. There, a simple granite bench had been installed. An anonymous donation, the town council had said, on a small bronze plaque. An inscription read Jessica Miller, a 1998 a 2022. She saw the truth. May she rest in peace. Sarah sat on the bench, the cold stone seeping through her jeans. She thought of Jessica, the girl with the hopeful smile and the artist's soul. She had come to Havenwood, seeking refuge, and had found a monster instead. But in the end, her voice had been heard. Her truth had come out. Her life, though tragically short, had mattered. It had brought down a king and cleansed the town. As she sat there, a figure approached. It was Thomas. He was taller now, or maybe he just stood up straighter. The haunted, fearful look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He was enrolled in community college in the next town over, studying criminal justice. I thought I might find you here, he said, his voice clear and even. It's a nice bench. Sarah replied softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Leo swing higher and higher. Thank you, Thomas said finally. his gaze fixed on the plaque. "For not giving up." "Thank you," Sarah said, turning to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "For being brave." He gave her a small, shy smile. We both were. They were an unlikely pair, a struggling single mother and a stuttering teenage boy to people the world had written off as powerless. But together, they had changed the world, or at least their small corner of it. They were a testament to the fact that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the playground, Sarah knew it was time to go. She called to Leo, who ran to her, his face flushed with happiness. She took his hand, and together, the three of them walked away from the park, away from Havenwood, towards a new life. The story left a lingering emotional echo, a haunting reflection. On the cost of truth, justice had been served, but the scars remained. A young woman was still dead. A little boy had seen something no child should ever see. A town's soul had been laid bare, its ugliness exposed for all the world to see. The healing would be slow, a bittersweet process of rebuilding and remembering. But in the quiet courage of a mother, a witness, and a victim who spoke through her art, there was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, the truth can take root, and that sometimes, the most powerful voices belong to those who have been silent for far too long. The playground was no longer a grave. It was a memorial, a quiet, haunting testament to the woman who had been buried there, and to the ordinary people who had refused to let her be forgotten. The silence of Havenwood had been broken, forever.